G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, with part 20 in my partial book reading series of One Crowded Hour, Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman. The second part of the chapter 17 with the Viet Cong. To recap, the soldiers posed with fierce expressions as I shot film, but invariably broke into laughter as the children shouted at them. Everyone wanted to offer tea to the foreign newsman, and Davis drank at least 30 scalding cups of green tea in the next 5 hours. During the 24 hours he spent with the Viet Cong, he was taken deeper into the jungle where he visited a number of villages. But Davis was very sensitive to anything in the air because he had no experience of handling such an attack. At about 5 p.m. that afternoon, his fears were realised. There was a village meeting going on, and I saw a helicopter pass over, flying high. I could see it was a gunship, which had banks of machine guns mounted 4x4, which could spew out 6,000 rounds a minute in a pattern. It was death to anybody on the ground if you were caught in it. The soldiers didn't take any notice of the helicopter when it went over, but I did. I didn't like it at all. It went on and almost disappeared. Then it turned back, and I realised that it was coming back again. This time everybody went quiet and sort of slunk back into the shadows, and they said, "Careful, we have to watch." And they told me they thought it was going to attack. This was their instinct. They didn't take any notice the first time, but as it was on its way back, they had a clear premonition that the pilot in the helicopter had seen something on the way over and was coming back to check them out. And their instinct was absolutely right, because as he appeared to be going past, the pilot suddenly banked and went into a dive, and I could see he was going to strafe. Even as the helicopter started to tip, the Viet Cong shouted, "Di Mao, go quickly." And we all fanned out, running out in a 360-degree radius. By the time the helicopter started to strafe, he could only pick one area. We were in bunkers in the jungle. The pilot had picked a building in a clearing to attack, and some were killed and wounded in that area before they could get to the bunkers. The gunship strafed up and down for half an hour while I crouched in a bunker with saplings on top of it with 5 Viet Cong soldiers. I thought, my God, this is the way I'm going to die, at the hands of the South Vietnamese people. I've spent 9 years with them, and now they're doing their best to blow me away right now. When Davis emerged, the jungle was stripped, leaves were hanging in shreds, and trees had been almost cut in half by swathe after swathe of gunfire. I wanted to get the hell out of there very fast, but they said, "Never mind, we've got a few minutes and then we'll trot off." Fortunately, I was very fit. They jogged off like long-distance runners. We went through a very complicated minefield. The soldier with me said to follow him exactly, but I had that habit anyway, after moving through the countryside with government soldiers, knowing that there were mines and booby traps everywhere. Davis was impressed that the Viet Cong soldiers regarded the South Vietnamese soldiers as easily their hardest opponents on the other side. They did not regard the American troops as being terribly difficult to defeat or elude. In fact, during our run, they said we must be careful of the South Vietnamese commandos because they sometimes came into a situation like this and they were difficult opponents. Each time the soldiers came to a hut, they whistled a bird call and waited for an answer before going on, to guard against possible ambush from the commandos. From a vantage point 2 kilometres away, they watched an airstrike on the area they had just left. Davis asked why they were not in much of a hurry to leave the spot when they could have been caught in the airstrike. The Viet Cong soldiers laughed. No, they said. "Surely you know the system. To get an airstrike, that helicopter pilot has to report to his commanding officer, and the commanding officer then has to go through the area commander, and he has to get the province chief's approval for a strike. That gives us plenty of time." They did admit to Davis that it came 5 minutes earlier than anticipated. As they watched, the fighter bombers devastated the bunkers they had just left. It was highly probable that the South Vietnamese authorities knew he was in the area. The Viet Cong themselves conceded that, and warned that within 24 hours the South Vietnamese would not only know that Davis was with them, but exactly where. They weren't surprised when the group was attacked. The South Vietnamese government was not keen for correspondents to get to the Viet Cong. If correspondents were killed while doing so, the South Vietnamese could not be held responsible because it was an ongoing war and it might discourage other journalists from doing the same thing. When you've got friends in the military, who the fuck needs enemies? Interesting thought, isn't it? When you've got friends in the military, who the fuck needs enemies? I don't think they wanted to kill me. I got on very well with the South Vietnamese, and even after they found I'd been out with the VC, they didn't hold it against me personally. They knew it was my job, what I had to do, but they didn't want to encourage journalists either, and the easiest way to discourage them was to attack the areas where they were known to be. Sort of like, nothing personal, it's just that there's an airstrike looking for you. Somebody said that to Tim Page once, the English still photographer. He was on a US Navy patrol boat and an airstrike found him, killed just about everybody else on the boat and wounded him terribly. Sometimes an airstrike was looking for the journalists. It was that kind of a war, from what I've been given to understand. In the early stages, Davis kept asking if he could film this or that, and the Viet Cong told him he could film anything he liked. But after the attack by the helicopter gunship, I could see some dead and wounded, and they were adamant I could not film that. There was no debate about it, it was simply not done. I don't know whether it was because they didn't want to be seen taking casualties or whether it offended their sensibilities. Crossing back to the South Vietnamese side was far more difficult than getting to the Viet Cong. Davis also knew that his chances of getting his film back to Saigon were fairly slim, and without the film the whole operation would have been a waste of time. The Viet Cong told him that government agents in the villages would have already reported his presence and that the authorities would be on the lookout for him. I asked if they could take me by another route, and they said only if I had another week to walk a further 100 kilometres. There was nothing for it, I had to take my chance. The Viet Cong soldiers said they would take me to within a kilometre of Highway 4, and then a group of children would take me the rest of the way. There were a group of 10 and 12-year-olds from the VC area who skipped and played around me as a kind of cover as we entered the South Vietnamese government-controlled village. Not more than 15 more minutes after Davis reached Highway 4, he was arrested by South Vietnamese troops and taken to a nearby town. He had no way of knowing whether the events that followed were just lucky or whether they were planned. I was taken to an army captain who happened to be a friend of mine. I certainly didn't know where his political sympathies lay. He asked me where I had come from, and I said Saigon. He said, "Well, you are very dirty and unshaven. I think you have come from somewhere else." I kept insisting that I had come from Saigon that morning. Then he said, "I've got to go out and do some business in my other office, and I will be away from this room for at least 5 minutes. You will be alone during that time. While I'm away, I'd like you to get your film together ready to give to me because higher command has ordered it to be handed over." Of course, that was deliberate. He went out and closed the door, and I got my exposed film and strapped it to the insides of my legs. If I had been searched, it would have been found immediately. The captain came back and said, "Now, have you got all your film?" I said, "Yes," and gave him all the unexposed film and cassette tapes that had not been used. He gave me a receipt and said, "You won't be searched again because of this receipt. If they ask you about your film, just show it to them. You are now about to be taken for interrogation." Davis could not have known whether the captain was protecting him out of friendliness or whether he was also a double agent. After the war, it was revealed that many middle-ranking ARVN officers were Viet Cong. The interrogation was much tougher and went on for 8 hours. Eventually, I saw that I was going to be kept overnight, and that's what I didn't want. Some nasty things can happen to you. So I said I had to get back to Saigon to report to my embassy, who knew that I had come into the countryside and would be expecting me. The ruse worked, and the commander didn't really know what to do because he was not anxious to make trouble with the embassy of an ally of South Vietnam. He let me go, and I was able to get my story out, including the helicopter gunship attack on the Viet Cong. Back in Saigon, Davis quickly shipped his film out of the country to London and took stock of the situation. I came away with the feeling that the Viet Cong did represent the people, but no more than most of the South Vietnamese did. Both sides wanted the same things: independence, freedom, and peace. But the big powers were pushing both sides for an ideological victory: communism versus so-called democracy. If they'd been allowed to settle their differences way back after World War II, the war in South Vietnam would almost certainly not have come to pass. They would have evolved and created an independent national government. Perhaps it would have been left-wing, communist, if you like, but nobody criticises a country like Yugoslavia much. This is a 1986 vintage book, and he was saying that in 1985 on a tape recorder. The foray with the Viet Cong was an enormous personal triumph. The film was circulated to more than 100 countries, and Viz News allowed Davis to write and publish the story widely. By his actions, he had demonstrated the complexity and confusion of the war. To see the conflict as one people attacked by rapacious and ideologically misguided foreigners was one of the most absurd simplifications imposed on a situation of sporadic and terrible violence. Good or frightened Vietnamese all had to keep their options open. They had responsibilities to families, and they could not foresee the future. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 14 February 1973, Continental Palace Hotel, Saigon. I have had some interesting times lately, a bit different from everything else I've ever done here. We'll tell you about it when I write from elsewhere. I had a byline story in the New York Times last week, which is all a bit strange, as American journalists strive for that. It seems their ultimate aim. I'm not aware of any other Australian or American journalist who ever went on patrol with the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. Wilfred Burchett, the Australian journalist, he went on patrol with the North Vietnamese army, and he went on patrol with the North Korean army. But, you know, he was a declared communist and persona non grata, and he didn't have an Australian passport. But he was a bloody good journalist. So, here endeth part 20 in my partial book reading series of One Crowded Hour, biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman, written by Tim Bowden. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.